So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vardhan, and on behalf of Edureka, I welcome you all to this session on React components. So, in one of my previous sessions, I gave you an introduction to what is React, and I spoke about various other topics. And today's session is going to be limited only to React components, and I'm going to go at that in detail. Okay, so without any further delay, let me show you what will be the topics I will be covering in this session. As you can see, first I will give you an introduction to what are React components and how they work. After that, I will talk about props and state. Now, props and state are an integral part of React components. Okay, I will talk about those things. And after that, I will talk about the flow of stateless and stateful components as to how the data flows between them. And finally, I will talk about the life cycle of these components. Okay, these will be the topics I will be covering. And getting started, this is the first topic, that is React components. And as you people might be aware that in React, everything is a component, right? So when we say everything, it is basically all whatever is visible on the web page or on the web browser, all those things, right? Whatever you see, they are divided into different components. Now you might be able to see an image, or you might be able to see a video, you might be able to see a text box with some details, and then you will find links to other pages. Now each of these are different components in that page. Okay, and that I've divided it over here. So if it's an image, you would have it here, which would be one component. The other component might be a video and things like that, right? Now, how does it work in a normal browser? Okay, in a HTML, how does it work? All these different layouts which will be there in the browser, they will all be linked with one another, right? They will come one after the other. But that is what is different in React. Even though you have all these things in the same page, they are separate from one another and they do not affect the other components. Okay, as you can see here, even though there are different components, they're not going to interfere with another component's performance. But you have to note that these are the building blocks of the entire React page, and together they form the application. But having said that, even if one of the React components is removed, then it's not going to get other components to be affected. That's because these components are independent of one another. All right, so you can make any changes you want. Supposing you want to remove one of the video sections from your page and you want to replace it with something else, you can do that. And all these things can be done without affecting the DOM. Okay, only the component which needs to be changed, only that component will be changed, and that will be re-rendered to the DOM. So that is the benefit with React, right? So it's highly responsive, and what change needs to be done, only that will be changed inside the web browser. Okay, so you should be clear on this topic by now. Now moving on to the next slide, we have something called as the React components UI tree. Now the entire UI of any page developed in React is divided into different logical pieces, and these logical pieces are only your components. Okay, and these components, even though they are independent of one another, they are in fact linked in one way, right? So it's not like all the components would straight away appear, or it would not be straight away called by your native browser. How it works is you have one component, and that component is indirectly linked to two other components. Okay, and those components will be linked to other components in that web page. So if you can see the UI tree on the right hand side, you can see that there is one, right? So the color coding represents which component I'm talking about. So the one that you see here, this is the root component or the parent component, and this parent component has two children components, 2 and 3. So these are the two components which we have in the web page. Okay, the example that I'm talking about is this one, and these are the two child components, and there are two other child components for this component, for component number 2. Okay, now this will act as a parent for components 4 and components 5. Now, even though these are independent of one another, they are linked in a way such that it is the first component which invokes its child component. So in this case, it would be 2 and 3. And similarly, these components 4 and 5 would be invoked by their parent components, which is component number 2. So that's how there's a relation between the components, right? Yeah, so you should not have the doubt that because they are linked with one another, that it will affect the performance or the visibility of the other components. No, that will not happen. It's just that their layout and their invocation, only that is done by the other component, as in their parent component. Okay, that is the only relation over here. Otherwise, these components are independent, and whatever you want to change in a particular component, you can do that without any hassle, and you will not disturb any other aspects of your web page. And now, speaking about the different components, let's go into details of what will be there in a component and how a component works. And to give you an example of that, I will show you that with the sample code that you see on the screen. And this is a hello world code. Okay, now this is a very simple code which would display these details inside this component. All right. And as you can see, the class command is what is used to initiate or start your parent component. That is component 1. And every parent component, it will have a render function. Okay, so irrespective of which whether it's a parent or a child component, the render function is a must. And what will the render function contain? It will basically contain all the HTML tags that need to appear on your web page. Okay, because the render function is what decides what will be the HTML representation of this component, right? Supposing I want to print hello world and welcome to Edureka on this component number 1, then I would have to specify that in HTML tags. Okay, and since there are 2 different HTML tags over here which I want to display, I have used the enclosing tags. Now the enclosing tags are what is given inside the div tags, right? Div. In case I just have one HTML tag, then in that case I don't need to use the div. All right, so that's how it works. And finally, it can have these components. Of course, they will have one render function, definitely, and along with that they can also have calls to other child components. In this sample case, I do not have any other child component. I'm not invoking anything else, so you do not see anything over here. Okay, but the other thing which would definitely be there in the component is rendering the DOM. So whatever components have so far been specified in your code, those will have to be rendered to the DOM, right? Now that is done in this call. So you're using this line of code to basically render all the components to the DOM. So I hope this slide is clear to all of you folks. Now that you know what are React components, now let's go into details about the 2 important aspects of components. These are the 2 important aspects, and those are prop and states. Okay. Now let's go into details of what these 2 are. Let's first talk about what props are in components. So you will have multiple components in your page, and props are what helps you communicate with other components. Supposing you want to invoke your child component, then the parent component does so with the help of props. If it wants to pass down any values to the child component, then whatever value is passed down, whatever data is passed down, it's called as props. Props is nothing but it's short for properties. So take our example over here. This is the parent component. The name of my parent component is body. Okay, and there's a render function over here, and inside the render function I have basically 2 tags. One is the header tag and the other is the footer tag. Now these are again 2 different components. Okay, now this is the syntax of invoking other children components, and in this case I'm not straight away using any header tag and writing any text. So the Bob and Alex that you see here, these are not going to be printed straight away. But what I'm going to do is I'm invoking the child component which has properties, and this props has the value of Bob, right? And since this would be passed down as props to the child would take care of other functionality as to what has to be displayed and what not. Similarly, I have another child component which is nothing but footer, and this again has a property name, and the value of this property is Alex. And as you can see on the image on your right, these are the 2 different components that will be there, which will come as an output for this code. Okay, you will have a header 1, and this component here has this code which says this.props.name. all right, and of course this component has the same, this.props.name. Now these 2 lines that you see here, which are very identical, these are what are used to identify props. If there is any props which is coming in from the parent component to the child component, then this is the line which is used to identify that. Okay, so in my case I am invoking the props with the value of Bob, so that Bob will be passed down to my child component over here, and when we say this.props.name, then Bob is what would be intermediately displayed over here. And similarly, for the sake of my footer, the name is Alex, and that is what is going to be displayed over here too. Okay, that's going to be my footer. So it's pretty simple slide. I hope you guys have clarity on this, right? This is Bob and Alex. This is how your page is going to look. All right, these 2 texts is what will be displayed on your web page. Now moving on, even if I change the value of these props, then that would also be reflected over here, because these will be the only 2 items which would be displayed to us on our page. And these components would interpret this.props.name to its value, and it would thus display 𝐂𝐞𝐫, and in this case it would display Miller, right? That's how the parent component invokes the child component with props, and that's how the child component displays whatever is given to it as props. Moving on to the next slide, let's talk about props in more detail. Now what are props and how do they work? So the props in React, they work very similar to HTML attributes. Just like how you can change the color and set the different aspects, you can do the same thing over here also. Okay, it's very easy to work on props in that way. And one important feature that you need to know is the data always flows downwards from the parent component to the children component. Okay, that's how it works in props. And the data that is there in these props, it's a unidirectional data flow. Okay, data flows from the top to the bottom. Another important aspect you need to note is props, which is nothing but the data always flows from the parent component to the child component, right? The child component cannot pass any value to the parent. Okay, and that is why we say that there is a unidirectional data flow over here, and this is from up to down. And one more important thing is props are immutable. Now when we say immutable, it means that whatever props are being passed or whatever data is passed from the parent to the child, this data cannot be modified by the child component. Okay, that's the meaning of immutable. It cannot be updated. It will have to use it as it is or display it as it is. And of course, the other thing is these child components can set its own default props. Now at times, if the parent component does not send any props to the child component, then at those times the child component can basically set its own props. So there's a rule for that, which will be executed and which will be displayed at times when there is nothing being passed from the parent. Okay, so that was about props, and this is an example code which I want to show you about props. Okay, so as you can see here, again I'm initiating my main component over here, which is nothing but the parent component, and this has one render function. Okay, and inside the render function I have one HTML tag which says hello world from Edureka, and along with that I have calls to three other child components. I'm calling the header component 2 times, and then I'm calling the footer component once, and each time I'm sending different values. Okay, now these are the props and these are the values for those props, and then I'm simply closing these tags with the help of my enclosing tag. Okay, now let's see how children components work. The children components would get the props from parent and it would simply display it. Okay, so I have a h2 tag which says the head name is this.props.name. So this.props.name is what comes from here, right? So it says name is the property and I'm setting that property over here. So this would be replaced by whatever value that property has. So in this case it would be Bob, and this would be the inside the h2 tag, and the h2 tag ends over here. And after this, since the next command would be executed, again I'm calling the header child component, and I would be printing a different value though this time. The value I'll be printing is that of max. Okay, so the same child component will be called and max should be printed this time. And when the third child component, which is footer, is called, the allen value will be passed along with the property. Okay, and similarly that would be replaced over here and displayed inside the h2 tags. Okay, so the footer name would be allen and accordingly the other things. And then finally I can end my code by rendering all these components to the DOM with this function. I explained this earlier also. So every time you write a React code, you have to always render all the components that you have defined to the DOM. So that's what I'm doing over here. So that is about props. Now let's go on to what are state. Okay, now state is a different topic altogether. Okay, it's a little similar to props, but still let's see what are the differences between props and state. The thing with state is that, so in props I earlier said that whatever value is passed from the parent component to the child component, they are immutable, that is they cannot be changed. However, the main difference between the two is that in state whatever comes down, it can be changed, and hence it's called state. Okay, so in props values cannot be changed, and in state the values can be updated. To give you an example, let's see this. There will always be a change in state with respect to time or with respect to other factors, right? That is being explained over here, where there is ice, and when the temperature increases, this ice melts into water, correct? And this change in state is because of some other factor. Now because of such factors, you might also want certain changes to happen in your web page. So at those times you would want to use state. So state is thus a very important aspect of components. And the important aspect with components is that since they can change, it will keep track of all the updates that are made. So in memory, it would store all the previous state, and whatever future states are there, those will also be stored in memory. Okay. And speaking of more details about state, I already told you that component states are mutable. Okay, that means the data can be updated and it can be changed. And these state objects, these are the ones which control the rendering and the behavior of your components. Okay. And because the state is so flexible, it is actually the most important part of your components, and we consider this as the core of the React components. And because it's the core, it has to be kept as simple as possible to enable readability. And as the diagram here represents, the state can be changed or updated with time or with certain actions. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Now, even in components, there are two types. One is stateless components and the other is stateful components. The stateless components are those which do not have any idea of what its previous state was, what its current state is, and what its future state is going to be. Okay, so it's just going to simply display whatever the parent component passes down to it. And the stateful component, on the other hand, is a very smart component because it keeps track of what was its previous state. It keeps track of that in memory. Okay, and it's always aware of what's its current state, and it can also update its current state, right? That's why this is a smart component. These are the two types of components. Okay, and moving on to the next slide, as you can see the representation, the stateful component is the parent component. It can be the child component at times, but the stateless components can never be parent components. Okay, the stateless components, they can only display whatever is being told to it by the stateful components. All right, but the stateful component can also sometimes display whatever it needs, and whenever needed, it will also pass down those states to the other stateless components. So that's what you need to remember about stateful components and stateless components. Okay, the stateless components, they calculate the internal state of the components, right? However, these stateful components, they are the core components which store information about the component's previous state or current state in memory. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Now let's see how there's a flow between these stateful and the stateless components. Okay, I'll explain that with an example of ES6 code. Okay, as you can see, this my app is my parent component. Okay, it's defined with the help of this class, and the constructor, this is my superclass which I'm using. Well, before I explain this code, I want to help you set the context. Now this code which I'm going to show you is for an application which would show if I'm currently logged in or if I've logged out of that application. It would display that status to me. And to display that, what I have to show is that when the application is initially accessed, it would always be logged out, right? You cannot sign into any application directly. So that is the very same reason why I'm setting the initial state of the application to logged out. And if I have to represent that in these terms, I've created a variable called isLoggedIn, and I'm setting isLoggedIn to false, which basically is the other meaning for the application I'm currently logged out of it, right? That's what I'm doing over here, setting the initial state. And after that, I have another function over here. Okay, the function is receive_click. So whenever I click the login button, the state has to change, right, from logged out to login. So for that functionality, I have written this line of code. Now initially this will not be executed straight away, but whenever a child component tells the parent component that there is some kind of action needed, then at that time my parent component will call my child component, will send down the props to my child component with this function call. Okay, that's what you're supposed to know. And when this function call is invoked, what happens is the current state is basically inverted. So if I'm currently logged out, then the next state should be logged in, right? Because when there's a button click, right, that's what we've said here, receive click. Whenever a click is received on the button, I would have to change from the logged out state to logged in state, and that is what I've defined here. So I'm setting the isLoggedIn value is not of this dot state dot is logged in. So if it's initially false, it would then become true, and that would be stored over here. That would be my new state. All right, and this would go down as props to my child component. And before I explain how it goes on to the child component, let me explain what is there inside the render function. So inside the render function, I have a number of HTML tags which I've defined inside the enclosing tags. Okay, I've first of all said that hello, I am a stateful parent component, which it's true. And then it says I monitor if my user is logged in or not. And then it says, let's see what is your status. And what I'm doing here is it prints the current status based on a conditional statement. In fact, initially when the application is accessed, it would be logged out. So I'm basically using the conditional statement to print what is my current status. For that, I'm saying this dot state dot is logged in, which I have initially set it over here. Correct? If my this dot state dot is logged in is true, then I would be printed you are logged in. But if this condition is false, then it would print not logged in. So in my case, initially it would print not logged in, right? Because my is logged in would be false. And because of that, this condition would fail, and this is what would be printed. And I'm basically closing these tags for that. And then I have other HTML tags where I'm saying, hi, I'm a stateless child component. Then I'm saying I'm a logging button. Then there's also another line which says, I don't maintain the state, but I tell the parent component if the user clicks me. Now, this is what I told you earlier when I said that the child component would notify the parent component that there has been some action and there has to be a state change. So the parent component would then do the honor of calling the child component with the appropriate props or the state. So in my case, what I'm doing is I'm using props. So my button that you see here, this is the child component that this parent component is going to call, and the function is click. So when there's a click that happens, then I'm basically binding whatever rules have been specified inside this function, right? Whatever operations that my receive click would do. That is there in my previous slide. So let me show you that. As you can see here, this dot state, right? This operation is inside my receive click. So whenever this dot receive click is called, then those functions would be binded to this particular prop. Okay, and this would be passed down to this child component. And similarly, the is logged in state, right? This would also be sent as a prop to my child component. So there will be two props which I will be sending. One is the function receive click along with binding, and then this dot state dot is logged in. This will also be sent. All right, great. I'll be passing props to my child component. Now finally, let me explain what will be there in my child component. So I've defined my child component with this, my button. Okay, and inside my HTML tags, I've said when there is a button on click, that is whenever the button to log in or log out is clicked, then use the props click. So this function would be invoked, right? And along with this, these two props would be handled, and it would receive these props from the parent component, and the state would change. And what I'm doing here is I'm just printing this click to with an arrow, and here I'm using props.isLoggedIn. So isLoggedIn is a prop which I'm passing from my parent component to child component. If you remember, this one is logged in, and it would simply print what is the current status. If I'm currently logged out, that would be printed here. But if I'm currently logged in, that would be printed in that case. Since in my previous slide, there was a click on the button, the state would change over here, right? The is logged in would then change to current state as logged in. So that is what would be sent over here. And if this props.isLoggedIn, if this condition is true, that is, if there's a true value over here, then this is what would be printed, that is logout. Okay, but if it is false, then login would be specified. Now the rule is such that this is the option to change the state again. If I'm currently logged in and if I want to log out, then I will have to click this button. So for that purpose, I'm again using the props to specify the current state, and I'm saying do this to log out or do this to log in. And since I'm calling the is logged in, then this would be called and my state would then be changed. Okay, that's how this would work. And then of course I'm closing the button tags for this, and then I'm closing also the enclosing tags inside which this button is present. Okay, and that's how I invert between login and logout. And finally, I'm rendering both these components to my DOM. That's how there is a flow of states between stateless to stateful components. Okay, I hope that code helped you understand what I just said. But if not, don't worry, because this example that I'm showing you, this would also help you otherwise. This was the HTML tag which I wanted to initially print. Hi, I am a stateful parent component, and currently the first time when you log in, you will of course be not logged in, right? You will be logged out. So for that, the initial state would be not logged in. This would be printed. And the moment this button is clicked, which is login button is clicked, then this state would change to you are logged in. Okay. And then of course, even this would get updated to logged in, because once you've logged in, then you would have to log out, right? So this is the logout button over here, and this is the login button. And yeah, the same rule is what I explained you over here during my child component and during my render function of my parent component. Okay. Now I hope you got a better understanding of React components over here, right? How the data flow happens. Okay, very good. So I can go to the next slide now, and that is component lifecycle. Okay, now this is the final topic in this session, and what I'm going to do here is I'll explain what are the different phases. So there are 4 different phases in your component lifecycle. Okay, the first will be your initial phase, the next will be your updating phase, the third will be your props change phase, and the fourth will be the unmounting phase. Okay, now let's see each of these in detail. This lifecycle phase would basically represent what are the different phases your component will pass over the lifetime. Okay, during its lifetime, what are the different component phases it will fall under. Okay, that's what I'm going to explain over here. And starting off with the first phase, in the initial phase, the component is just about to make its way to the DOM. All right, now is when it's just gotten invoked, but it has not been passed on to the DOM. Okay. And this phase will have 5 important methods. The first method is that of get default props. Okay, now this method allows you to specify the default value of this dot props. It gets called before your component is even created or any props from the parent is passed on. All right. And then we have another method which is the get initial state, and the get initial state method allows you to specify the default value of this dot state before your component is created, just like get default props. But this too gets called before your component is created. And the next method is component will mount. Okay, this is the last method that gets called before your component gets rendered to the DOM. There is an important thing you have to understand about this method, and that is if you were to call the set state inside this method, then your component will not be able to re-render. That's the thing. Okay, and then you have a render method, and by now you should be familiar with this method, right? Every component will have this method defined, and this is what is responsible for returning a single root HTML node which may have child nodes inside it. I mean, if you don't wish to render anything, simply return null, or you can return false. And then the next method that you have over here is that of component did mount. Now this method gets called immediately after your component renders and gets placed on the DOM. So at this point, you can safely perform any DOM querying operations without worrying about whether your component has made it or not. So that's what this method does. And one thing you need to remember here is that except the render method, all of these lifecycle methods can fire only once. And this is all done in the initial phase. Now let's go to the updating phase, which is the next phase, and see what methods that we have there and what the updating phase basically does. So in the updating phase, if there is any change to your state, then that will be updated and re-rendered over here. Okay. So yeah, basically if there is any update or re-render to your states in your components, then that will fall under this updating phase. And this again has these four methods. Okay. The first is should component update. So sometimes you might not want your component to update when a state change occurs. This method allows you to control this updating behavior. And if you use this method and return a true value, the component will update. And in case this method returns a false value, then at that time this component will just simply skip the updating aspect. And then you have another method which is component will update. Now this will get called just before your component is about to update, as the name suggests. One thing you should note is that you can't change your state by calling this dot set state from this method. Okay, and after that you have the render method, just like the initial phase. And if you didn't override the update via the should component update method, the code inside this render method will get called again to ensure your component displays itself properly. Okay, and the final component is that of component did update. Now this method gets called after your component updates and the render method has been called. So if you need to execute any code after the update takes place, you can put it inside this method. Okay, so that's what is about the updating phase. Now let's go on to the next phase, which is nothing but the props change phase. And in this phase, if there is any change to the props in that state, if any prop is getting updated and re-rendered, then that component would be under this phase of its life cycle. Okay, and this again has the same set of methods that we had in the updating phase. Okay, except for this method that you see here, components will receive props. This is the only addition in this particular phase. And this method basically returns one argument, and this argument will contain the new prop value that is to be assigned to it. Okay, the rest of the lifecycle methods will behave identical to the methods which we saw in the previous phase when dealing with the prop change. And finally, down to our last phase, which is the unmounting phase. Here is when our component is being destroyed. That time your component will fall under this phase, okay, which is the unmounting phase. It would be destroying where the DOM will get destroyed from the browser. And here you have one method which is component will unmount. Okay, and you can perform any cleanup related tasks over here, such as removing any event listeners or stopping timers, etc. And after this method gets called, your component is straightaway removed from the DOM permanently. Okay, so now we are done with all the phases of our components lifecycle along with their methods. So let's move on to the next slide then. And this would be the last slide in my session, and it's all about the component lifecycle in a glance. So if you were attentive and if you remember what I explained all this time, then this is just an overview that you have over here, right? So you have the component will receive props over here. After that, you have the should component update and all these things. So I do request you to go through this and spend enough time on this slide to understand the entire lifecycle. Okay, so this brings me to an end of this slides. And next what I have for you is a demonstration of this particular topic. Okay, And this basically brings an end to my session on React components. All right. So guys, as you can see, I've opened up a WebStorm for showing my React code. And in this demo, I'm going to show you a simple application which I've created. Okay. And this application is about how the data will get incremented. So you have a button there and you have a counter on my application. Whenever the button is clicked, then that counter will be incremented by 1. So initially, we have to set the value of our counter to 0, right? So all these things is what I've covered in this code. And let me get started with the code. And the most important thing that you need to know is the my app, right? So this is the name of my parent component. I've defined it here. And since I told you that my counter will initially have a value of 0, I have to set that state, right? So that's what I've done here. I'm using this dot state to set the value of my data to 0. So initially I'm setting it to 0. And later, if I want to increment it, then I have to use a different function to increment it. So this is going to be the initial state, however. And as you can see, this is a function which is set new number. So whenever there's a click on the button done, that time the value has to be incremented, right? So that function, I've defined it over here, set a new number, where I'm using the data that I've set over here. And to this, I'm increasing by 1. Okay, so every time the button is clicked, the data, the value of my state will be incremented by 1. That's what's going to happen over here. And that's all my parent component is going to contain. So after this, I've simply used a render function to basically display everything via my HTML, right? So in my render function, for that purpose, I have used 2 tags. Okay, I've used the button tag, which would basically record any mouse click that I perform. And whenever the mouse click happens on the button, I've used the onClick function for that to capture that. Right? So this dot set new number, right? This would be called. So whenever the button is clicked on the mouse, the set new number would be called. And since the first time when it's called, the value would be initially 0, that would be incremented to 1, and that is what would be set. Okay, that value would be sent here. So in the next line of code, what I've done is I've called my child component, and my component name is content. Okay, and my num is the props that I'm sending down to my child component. Okay, and this dot state dot data, right? This whatever data is the updated value of my data, right? That is what I'm trying to send to my child component. And what I want my child component to ideally do is only display this data. So my parent component here is going to act like the stateful component, and my child component is going to be the stateless component, which is the dumb component, and it would simply display whatever it's been told, right? So the one thing that you people need to note is my state is sent down as props from my parent component to my child component. Okay. Now that we've seen my parent component, and now that I've showed you how the data is sent to my child component, right? How the state is sent down as props. Let's go to the child component and see what happens over here. Okay. So guys, this is my child component. And as I told you earlier, content is the name of my child. And inside this child component, I have called these methods, which I explained during my slides. So during its life cycle, I told you that it would call different methods. Right now, those methods, to give you an explanation, I've shown it over here by calling those methods with a text which will be printed. So I've used the console.log command to display this text on my console. So when my component will mount method is called, this line of text would be displayed because of this command, console.log. Okay. And similarly, when my component did mount method is called, this text component did mount would be displayed on the console. And similarly, for each and every method which I call here, I've appropriately put down that text. So for component will receive props, what will be displayed is component will receive props. And for should component update, I'm basically returning true. Okay. And similarly, there's component will update, and I've printed component will update. And for component did update, I've similarly said component did update. And finally, when the component will unmount, I've said the text that will be displayed is component will unmount. All right. So this is just for your explanation. I've tried to put down those methods over here. And since this is again my child component, I will have to have a render function. Right now, I've used this render function to accept the props. So whatever props comes from my parent, I've used that to display it over here. And I've used the this.props.mynum to display that data. So the current data is what it will be sent down. If you remember, I'm using mynum as a prop to send down the current data, and the data, whatever is the current value of my state, that would be sent to mynum, and that I'm receiving over here, and I'm printing it inside the h2 tags. Okay. And my render function is only going to do this much. It's only going to display my h2 tag. All right, guys. Okay, so that's all about my child component. Okay, now that I've defined both my parent and my child components functionalities, what we have next is the React DOM.render. Now what this would do is simply it would render my components to the DOM. Okay, this will be the final step or the final set of lines in my code. And whatever components that I have, both my parent component and my child component, they would be rendered here onto the HTML by using the ID content. Okay, so you can see the name of my parent component here, my app. All right, so that's how it's done. And to also show you how the unmounting actually happens, right? Now I've explained all these methods and told you that how the component will fall under different phases. But if you want to destroy your DOM, how will that happen? So for that purpose, I've used a timeout to basically which will destroy my DOM after a set period of time. And the time period which I've set is 30,000 milliseconds, which is basically 30 seconds. Okay, so after 30 seconds, this function would be called and my unmount component would be executed and it would just destroy my components from the DOM. Okay, so let me quickly execute this code and show you this code, okay, how it works. So for that purpose, let me open up the terminal and execute the npm command. Okay, so the command is npm run it. All right, okay, my application is being served from localhost 8080 and yes, it's compiled successfully. So now let me go to my localhost 8080 and yes, this is the application. So now this is the simple button that we have and this is the counter. Okay, now if I click on this button, then the value over here would be incremented, right? So if I click on increase, it's incremented by 1. If I click on it again, it's incremented by 1 more and it's now 2. Now that's how the data gets incremented and that's how using React, the data is what you get, what is displayed to you, that is being updated continuously, right? The components gets re-rendered on the DOM. And if you noticed right now, the component also got destroyed. That's because of the unmount command, which would have been executed after 30 seconds from launching the browser. Okay, let me explain that again. So this time, remember that after 30 seconds of launching this application, my component would get unmounted automatically. So I'm going to refresh this. Okay, so 30 seconds from now, this component will be unmounted. Okay, so till then we can increase it, we can hit the button any number of times and that many times the counter would have increased by 1. Okay, so let's wait for a few more seconds. Yeah, so that's where so as you can see, the component got destroyed. All right, now to show you how the different methods are being called at different times, let me open up the console. Okay, now this is the console and as you can see, these many methods were called during this phase because I had incremented it 10 times, right? Now let me refresh this page. Now you can see initially the components were rendered for the first time and those times the component will mount and the component did mount methods got executed. Okay, now if I increment the button, then these 3 methods were called, right? The component will receive props, the component will update and component did update. Now if I again increment it, the same 3 methods would be called again, right? Component receive props, the component will update and the component did update. And since the 30 seconds are done, the component will get destroyed and will be removed from the DOM and that will be done by the help of the component will unmount method. Okay, so that's how the entire functionality works. All right guys, so I hope you guys had a good understanding of how this happened. Now this is a very simple application. However, I would request you people to explore the code, play around with React and learn more and develop more complex applications. Okay guys, so thank you for being in the session and we will let you know of the next session that we have on React and you can join us and we can learn a lot together. All right, and until then, see you, happy learning.